Before there was a World Wide Web, there was a worldwide road. It wasn't forged from fiber optics and light, but from grit and silk. A ghost of a highway stretching 7,000 miles across brutal deserts and bone-chilling mountain peaks, haunted by the memory of fortunes made and empires lost. They call it the Silk Road, but that name is far too simple, too gentle for what it truly was. This was the circulatory system of the ancient world, a conduit not just for shimmering threads that could bankrupt Rome, or for spices worth more than gold. It was a network that carried prophets with new gods, armies with new weapons, and the invisible seeds of plagues that would bring civilizations to their knees. In this journey, we're not just looking at history. We're pulling back the curtain on the blueprint of our modern world. We will tell the epic story of the conquerors and kings who tried to control it. But more importantly, we will uncover the forgotten stories of the individuals who gave it life. The merchant who risked everything on a single caravan, the monk who walked 1,000 miles in search of a single idea, and the diplomat whose personal failure accidentally opened the world. Because the Silk Road never really ended, it just evolved. And its ancient rules of connection, conflict, and contagion still govern our lives today. Join us as we unveil its secrets. It begins with a name, and like most things concerning this story, the name is a ghost. A modern invention that attempts to label something ancient, wild, and far too vast for any single definition. Seidenstraßen, the Silk Roads, coined in 1877 by the Baron von Richthofen, a man of science trying to impose order on a history written in sand and stone. He saw a line on a map, a conduit for commerce from east to west, with silk as its most precious cargo. But what he named was merely a shadow of the truth. The term was born of its time, in the heat of the Great Game, that Cold War of shadows fought between the British and Russian empires across the chessboard of Central Asia. For them, these ancient paths were vectors of influence, potential routes for armies and spies. They saw lines of control. They failed to see the arteries of a living world. To call it a road is to misunderstand its very essence. A road is a human imposition, a scar of stone and gravel laid upon the earth with a clear beginning and a definite end. The Silk Road was never so simple. It was not a singular entity. It was a sprawling, decentralized, organic network, less a highway and more a circulatory system for the planet. It was a biological process playing out on a geopolitical scale. Its pathways were the arteries and capillaries. The bustling oasis cities were the vital organs. And its lifeblood, that was a flow of not just silk and spices, but of ideas, languages, technologies, philosophies, religions, and the very DNA of the human race. It was humanity's first attempt at a planetary consciousness, a fragile web woven through the most forbidding landscapes on Earth, held together not by the decree of an emperor, but by the simple, powerful human calculus of risk and reward. Before von Richthofen gave it a name, it had 1,000 others. The locals knew it only as the path to the next oasis, the trail to Samarkand, the way of the merchants. It had no official title because it was simply the way things were. It was the current in the great river of human interaction, and for nearly 2 millennia its flow shaped the world. But this current did not spring from a vacuum. It followed channels carved by far older streams. The Persian Royal Road, a marvel of engineering described by Herodotus, stitched the Achaemenid Empire together from the Aegean Sea to the heart of Persia. To the north, on the vast, wind-scoured steppes, the Scythian horse lords created their own nomadic empire of trade, a world of gold and leather stretching from the Black Sea to the Altai Mountains. And then came Alexander. When Alexander the Great smashed the Persian Empire in the 4th century BC, his phalanxes marched deeper into Asia than any Western army before them. He founded cities, Alexandrias, in the furthest reaches of the known world. In what is now Afghanistan and Tajikistan, he left behind not just garrisons, but a legacy of Greek culture, its art, its philosophy, its way of seeing the world. This Hellenistic seed, planted in the soil of Bactria and Sogdiana, would lie dormant for a time, waiting. It was waiting for a new connection, a new catalyst from the East. It was waiting for the journey of one man, a single, stubborn diplomat from the burgeoning empire of the Han. But for that man to even begin his journey, he would have to contend with the true ruler of this world, geography. Before we can understand the history, we must first pay tribute to the landscape. For on the Silk Road, geography was not a passive backdrop. It was an active, malevolent character in the story. It was the antagonist, the ultimate gatekeeper, and its most formidable fortress was a desert in northwest China, a place whose Uyghur name is a chillingly direct warning, Taklamakan. You can get in, but you can't get out. They called it the Sea of Death, and for good reason. It is one of the largest sandy deserts in the world, a depression filled with mountains of shifting sand created by the rain shadow of the mighty Himalayas to the south and the Tian Shan Range to the north. These mountains strip the moisture from the air, leaving the Taklamakan in a state of perpetual thirst. Temperatures here are a study in extremes, soaring to well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer and plunging to 40 below in the winter. To cross it was a descent into a special kind of hell. The journey was a slow, agonizing crawl, a battle against dehydration, heat stroke, and the sheer, soul-crushing monotony of the landscape. The fine, wind-blown sand, or loess, would get into everything: food, water, lungs. Travelers spoke of the psychological terrors of the desert, the disorienting mirages that promised water and delivered only madness, the strange, singing sands, a low moaning sound produced by the wind that was attributed to demons and ghosts of travelers who had perished. They told stories of entire caravans, hundreds of men and animals, swallowed whole by sudden sandstorms, their treasures and their bones buried for eternity, creating legendary lost cities beneath the dunes. And these weren't just legends. On the fringes of this abyss, archaeologists have found the haunting remains of those who failed, and those who, for a time, succeeded. The ruins of Lulan and Nia, frozen in time, have been called the Pompeii of the Silk Road. Here, the desiccating climate has preserved everything: wooden houses, official documents written on slips of wood, even the bodies of the dead, their faces still etched with the struggles of life on the edge of oblivion. To survive the Taklamakan, caravans had to cling to its edges, navigating a perilous path between two chains of oasis towns, a northern route and a southern route that hugged the foothills of the mountains. These oases were the only thing that made the journey possible. These oases were jewels strung on a thread of desperation. Places like Kashgar, Turpan, and the legendary Dunhuang were not merely rest stops. They were vibrant, complex micro-civilizations, their existence a miracle of human ingenuity. Their secret was water, not from the sky, but from beneath the earth. They were fed by ingenious underground irrigation systems, known as kurez or kanats. These were gently sloping tunnels, dug by hand for miles, that tapped the groundwater from the base of the nearby mountains and channeled it to the desert floor. This ancient technology, a masterpiece of engineering, created fertile pockets of green in a world of yellow sand. These oases became cultural laboratories. Here, in the markets and caravanserais, a merchant from Persia could haggle with a trader from China. A Buddhist monk from India could debate philosophy with a Nestorian Christian from Syria. Languages, ideas, and genes mingled, creating a unique hybrid culture that was the true soul of the Silk Road. But to reach these havens, one often had to pass through the gates of heaven and hell themselves, the mountain ranges that encircled the Taklamakan. To the north lay the Tian Shan, the celestial mountains, a wall of rock and ice separating the desert from the great Eurasian steppe. To the west, the journey became a vertical climb into the Pamirs, a dizzying convergence zone where the great mountain systems of Asia, the Tian Shan, the Karakoram, the Hindu Kush, all collide. This is a landscape sculpted by gods, meant for eagles, not men. Here the enemy was not heat, but cold and altitude. The air thins, starving the lungs and brain of oxygen, inducing a debilitating sickness the locals knew as the curse of the mountains. Passes were often little more than goat tracks clinging to sheer precipices, subject to sudden blizzards, rockfalls, and avalanches. To cross these ranges was to survive a trial by ordeal. It required a hardiness and a resolve that bordered on the superhuman. It required a powerful motivation, a mission of such importance that any risk, even death, was acceptable. And in the 2nd century BC, such a mission was born in the court of the most powerful man in the East. This is Chang'an, the capital of the Han Dynasty, in the year 138 BC. At the time, it was the largest and most sophisticated city on Earth, and at its center sat Emperor Wu, one of the most consequential rulers in Chinese history. He was a brilliant strategist, a reformer, and an expansionist, driven by a vision of a secure and dominant Chinese empire. But his grand vision was threatened by a persistent, bleeding wound on his northern border. The Xiongnu, to the Han, they were an existential threat, a powerful confederation of nomadic tribes who ruled the steppes. Their entire way of life was a stark contrast to the settled, agricultural world of the Chinese. They were a mobile nation on horseback. Their mastery of cavalry warfare was unparalleled. They could strike deep into Han territory, plunder settlements, and vanish back into the grasslands before the imperial army could effectively respond. The Great Wall, a series of defensive fortifications, was a costly and only partially effective solution. For decades, the Han had tried appeasement, sending tribute, princesses for marriage, but these policies had only emboldened the Xiongnu. Emperor Wu was done with appeasement. He wanted a final solution. He wanted to break their power forever, and he had a plan. He had learned from captured Xiongnu that a rival tribe, the Yuezhi, had been crushingly defeated by them years earlier and had been forced to migrate far to the west, beyond the deserts and mountains. If he reasoned, he could find these Yuezhi, who nursed a bitter hatred for the Xiongnu. He could forge a military alliance. Together, they could attack the Xiongnu from both east and west in a giant pincer movement. It was a brilliant, daring, strategic gambit, but it depended on one thing: finding the Yuezhi in a vast, unknown world. For this, he needed an envoy, someone tough, loyal, and incredibly resourceful. He chose a mid-ranking military officer named Zhang Qian. The mission was one of the greatest long shots in history. Zhang Qian was tasked with leading an expedition of 100 men across a territory controlled by his mortal enemies to find a displaced tribe whose exact location was unknown. The odds were impossibly long. They became even longer when, just a short way into their journey, the entire expedition was captured by the Xiongnu. His mission should have ended there. By all rights, he should have been executed. But the Xiongnu leader, perhaps impressed by Zhang Qian's courage or seeing his potential value, spared his life. And so began one of the most remarkable odysseys in the annals of exploration. Zhang Qian became a prisoner. for 10 years, a full decade. For 10 years, Zhang Qian lived the life of a Xiongnu. He was no longer just an envoy of the Han. He was a husband, a father, a member of the very community he had been sent to fight against. This is the psychological heart of his journey. How does a man maintain his identity, his loyalty, his sense of mission, when his old life is a fading dream and his present reality is all he has? Did a part of him become one of them? He learned their ways not as a spy, but as a participant. He understood their strengths, their weaknesses, their worldview. He was a prisoner, yes, but his mind remained free, and he never, for a single day, forgot the emperor's command. He was waiting for his chance. After a decade, that chance came. During a period of political instability, he saw an opportunity. He took his wife, his son, and a single loyal attendant, and they escaped, fleeing not back east to China, but further west to complete his original mission. Now he faced the tyranny of geography alone. He crossed the Taklamakan and then began the climb into the roof of the world. What he endured is almost beyond comprehension. But after weeks of travel, starving and frostbitten, he descended from the mountains and into a valley, a world unlike any he had ever seen. He had reached the Fergana Valley. He had found the land of the Dayuan. He found a civilization that was a distant echo of Alexander's conquests, but more importantly, he found their horses. The heavenly horses, the Chinese would later call them. They were a different breed entirely, the product of centuries of careful breeding in the lush pastures of Fergana. They were rumored to sweat blood, a phenomenon likely caused by a skin parasite, but which only added to their mythic status. To Zhang Qian, a military man, the significance was immediate and overwhelming. A horse like this could carry a fully armored rider into battle. It had the stamina and power to outmaneuver and overwhelm the Xiongnu cavalry. This wasn't just a fine animal, it was the key to the security of the Han Empire. It was the ultimate military technology. He had found the Yuezhi, but they had settled into a new life and had no desire for revenge against the Xiongnu. In his primary objective, Zhang Qian had failed, but what he had discovered was infinitely more valuable. He spent a year in Central Asia, a diplomat from a lost world, traveling, observing, gathering information. Then he began the long journey home. He was captured by the Xiongnu again and held for another year before finally escaping during the chaos following a chieftain's death. 13 years after he had departed, Zhang Qian returned to Chang'an. He had failed in his mission to forge an alliance, but his report, delivered to a stunned Emperor Wu, would change the world. It was a detailed intelligence dossier of the civilizations, the economies, the politics, and the wonders of Central Asia. He spoke of wealthy kingdoms, of strange customs, and most importantly, of the heavenly horses. His journey, born of military necessity, had torn a hole in the curtain of ignorance that separated China from the West. His report ignited the imagination of the Han court. It created a desire for the horses, for trade, for knowledge of the world beyond the Jade Gate. The first official caravans, dispatched by the emperor, soon followed the path he had blazed. The Silk Road was not conceived in a grand design. It was born from the unintended consequences of a single man's epic failure. It was forged in the crucible of his 10-year captivity, his harrowing escape, and his unwavering resolve. Zhang Qian wasn't trying to create a global network. He was just a soldier and a diplomat trying to serve his emperor and get home. But in doing so, he pulled a thread that would, over the centuries, weave the entire world together. If the journey of Zhang Qian was the spark that lit the fuse, then what followed was the explosion, a slow-motion detonation that rippled across the Eurasian landmass for over 1,000 years. The network he unwittingly pioneered became the stage for a new act in the human drama. It was a story driven by the most fundamental of human impulses, desire. The desire for things, yes, but also the far more potent desire for meaning, for salvation, for knowledge. This next chapter of the Silk Road is not about a single journey, but about the cargo itself, the tangible and the intangible. It's about how the things we trade in the end wind up trading us, transforming civilizations from the inside out. First came the objects of desire, the material goods that lured merchants onto the treacherous paths, and none was more potent, more legendary than silk. To understand the ancient world, you must understand the mystique of this single thread. In the West, its origins were a complete mystery, a subject of wild speculation. The Roman poet Virgil wrote that the Chinese combed the fleece from trees. Others imagined it was a product of a special soil or flower. The truth was both more mundane and more miraculous. It was the secret of a moth, Bomx mori, and the painstaking process of its cultivation, known as sericulture. For centuries, this was China's most fiercely guarded state secret. Anyone caught smuggling silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds out of the empire faced death. This monopoly gave China immense economic power. The thread spun from the cocoon of the worm is a protein fiber, triangular in cross-section, which allows it to refract light like a prism. This is what gives silk its shimmering, almost magical luster. It was lightweight, yet strong. It took dye beautifully. It was cool in summer and warm in winter. In the Roman Empire, it was an object of pure obsession. When the first bolts of this fabric arrived, they caused a sensation. It was so fine, so translucent, it both concealed and revealed the human form, and moralists like Seneca the Younger railed against it as a material that reveals what it is meant to hide, a symbol of feminine extravagance and moral decay that was draining the empire's coffers. He wasn't entirely wrong about the economics. Rome had little to offer China that the Chinese wanted, besides its gold and silver. Historians like Pliny the Elder lamented the staggering amounts of Roman currency, perhaps 100 million sesterces a year, flowing east to pay for silk, spices, and other trifles, a trade imbalance that destabilized the imperial economy for generations. In Central Asia itself, silk became a currency. Rulers and commoners used bolts of silk to pay taxes, buy horses, and settle debts. It was more stable and portable than coin. This simple thread, produced by a worm, was reweaving the economic fabric of the world. But the caravans traveling east carried their own wonders. Roman merchants sent their finest glassware, objects of breathtaking fragility and beauty. The Romans were masters of glass, creating intricate cage cups or vasa diatrata, a single block of glass carved into a delicate outer lattice connected to an inner cup by hidden posts. To the Han Chinese, who were used to bronze and jade, this transparent, jewel-like material must have seemed like solidified light, a form of captured magic. And of course, there was the constant flow of Western gold, silver, and Central Asian jade, precious metals and stones that filled the treasuries of the East. Yet, this was only the surface level of the exchange. The Silk Road was also a conveyor belt for the sense of paradise. From the Spice Islands, the Maluku Islands in modern-day Indonesia, came cloves and nutmeg, tiny dried things worth more than their weight in gold. From India and Ceylon came black pepper, the king of spices, and fragrant cinnamon. In Europe, these were not just flavorings. They were potent symbols of status, essential ingredients in medicine, and critical components of religious incense. In an age before effective refrigeration, they were also vital preservatives, masking the taste of decay and making stored meat palatable. The journey of a single peppercorn from a vine in Kerala to a Roman banquet table was an epic in itself, passing through the hands of countless middlemen, its price increasing exponentially at every step. It was the desire for these spices that would, centuries later, drive European explorers like Vasco da Gama and Columbus to seek new sea routes to the east, ultimately ending the overland Silk Road's dominance. So the network hummed with this traffic of tangible things. Silk, glass, spices, metals, jade, horses, porcelain, the white gold that would later become another Eastern obsession. It was a world driven by luxury, profit, and the universal human desire to possess that which is beautiful, rare, and comes from afar. But to see the Silk Road as merely a commercial enterprise is to see only the body and miss the soul. The most transformative cargo was invisible. It was carried not in saddlebags, but in the minds and hearts of the travelers. This was the trade in ideas. Nothing better illustrates this intangible exchange than the journey of a single idea, Buddhism. Born in the 6th century BC in the foothills of the Himalayas in India, the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama were initially a philosophical system, a path to enlightenment. But as this idea traveled, it transformed. It moved northwest into the region of Gandhara, in modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. This was a land that had been saturated in Hellenistic culture since the time of Alexander the Great. Here, in this remarkable melting pot, Buddhism collided with Greek artistic traditions. For the first time, the Buddha was depicted in human form, and he looked remarkably like a Greek god. He was given wavy, Apollo-like hair, a Roman nose, and wore a toga-like robe. This Greco-Buddhist art was a stunning fusion of Eastern philosophy and Western aesthetics. And it was this visually powerful, relatable form of Buddhism that began its journey east along the Silk Road. Its patrons were often the Kushans, a nomadic people who had settled in the region and built a vast empire, with emperors like Kanishka the Great becoming legendary champions of the faith. Buddhism entered a China that was, at times, spiritually hungry. The Han Dynasty had been built on the rigid social hierarchy of Confucianism and the esoteric philosophies of Taoism. But during the centuries of chaos and warfare that followed the Han's collapse, these systems offered little comfort to the suffering masses. Buddhism arrived with a message of universal compassion, a path to salvation from suffering, and a rich cosmology of heavens, hells, and enlightened beings or bodhisattvas who could offer aid to mortals. It spread not through conquest, but through a slow, patient process of transmission. Monks from Central Asia, like the great translator Kumarajiva, traveled to China, while devoted Chinese pilgrims, like the famous Faxian and Xuanzang, made the perilous journey west to India to retrieve original scriptures. Xuanzang's 17-year odyssey, a real historical event, became the basis for one of the greatest works of Chinese literature, Journey to the West, transforming the pious monk into a legendary hero accompanied by a magical monkey king. The Silk Road was the conduit for this entire epic exchange. The caves at Dunhuang, the Mogao Grottos, became a magnificent library and art gallery of this faith, with centuries of murals and manuscripts testifying to the depth of Buddhist devotion along the route. But the Buddha did not travel alone. The Silk Road was an open highway for faith. From Persia came Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, with its concepts of a single creator God, a cosmic battle between good and evil, and an eventual final judgment. ideas that would profoundly influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Following in its wake came Manichaeism, a fascinating and powerful new religion founded by the prophet Mani in the 3rd century AD. Mani saw himself as the final successor to a line of prophets including Zoroaster, Buddha, and Jesus. He wove their teachings into a compelling new narrative of a primordial battle between a kingdom of light and a kingdom of darkness. For a time, Manichaeism was one of the major religions of the world, stretching from North Africa to the South China Sea, and its adherents were famously literate and artistically gifted. And there were Christians here, too, not the Christians of Rome, but Nestorian Christians, members of the Church of the East. They followed a theological interpretation that had been declared heretical by the councils of the Western Church, and they sought refuge and converts in the East. They founded bishoprics in oasis cities like Merv and Samarkand, and even made their way to the Tang capital of Chang'an, where in 781 they erected the famous Nestorian stele, a massive stone monument inscribed in both Chinese and Syriac, documenting the history of their faith in China. For a time, the Silk Road was a place of astonishing religious pluralism, a world where a Buddhist monastery, a Christian church, and a Zoroastrian fire temple might stand within a few blocks of each other in the same city. This flow of ideas was supercharged by the flow of technology, and no technology was more revolutionary than paper. Invented in China during the Han Dynasty, it was a miracle of practicality. Before paper, the world wrote on clumsy, expensive, or fragile surfaces: clay tablets in Mesopotamia, papyrus reeds in Egypt, parchment made from animal skin in Europe, bamboo slips and silk in China. Paper was cheap, lightweight, durable, and could be mass-produced. It was the perfect medium for the transmission of knowledge. The secret of its manufacture traveled west with excruciating slowness. It finally reached the Islamic world in a dramatic fashion. At the Battle of Talas in 751 AD, in modern-day Kyrgyzstan, the Abbasid Caliphate clashed with the Chinese Tang dynasty. The Abbasids were victorious, and among their prisoners were Chinese artisans who knew the art of papermaking. The technology was quickly established in Samarkand, then Baghdad and Damascus, and from there it entered Europe through Spain and Sicily. Without this cheap, abundant medium from China, it is hard to imagine the flourishing of science in the Islamic Golden Age, or the explosion of learning in the European Renaissance, which was itself kickstarted by Gutenberg's printing press, a device that is only truly revolutionary if you have something cheap to print on. Paper, gunpowder, the magnetic compass, printing itself. These were the silent revolutionaries, the sleeper agents sent west along the Silk Road that would ultimately awaken and remake the Western world. This brings us to a crucial question. Who were the actual agents of this transformation? It wasn't just emperors, monks, and missionaries. The entire system was lubricated by a class of people who have been largely forgotten by history, a people who were the true masters of the network. They were the Sogdians. The Sogdians were an Iranian people whose homeland was centered on the fertile river valleys around the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. In modern-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, they never built a great empire of their own. They didn't need to. For centuries, they were the undisputed middlemen of the Silk Road. They were the world's greatest long-distance traders. Their language became the lingua franca of the road, the English of its day. Their trade colonies could be found in nearly every major oasis town from the borders of Byzantium to the heart of China. Their success was built on a unique cultural adaptability. Their own religion was a pragmatic blend of local deities and Zoroastrianism, but they were famously tolerant and willing to engage with any faith if it facilitated trade. A Sogdian merchant might personally be a Zoroastrian, but he would happily fund the construction of a Buddhist monastery or donate to a Christian church if it was good for business and community relations. They were the ultimate cultural brokers. Thanks to archaeological discoveries like the Sogdian ancient letters, a cache of correspondence found in a watchtower near Dunhuang, we have intimate, first-hand accounts of their vast network, of their family concerns, their business dealings, and the challenges they faced. To understand their role, let's leave the realm of emperors and religions and imagine the world through the eyes of one of them. Let's imagine a woman named Aisha, the daughter of a prominent Sogdian merchant family in Samarkand in the early 7th century. Her world is not one of conquest, but of contracts. Her family's business deals in silk from China, lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan, and carnelians from India. From a young age, she has been trained in the family trade. She is multilingual, numerate, and possesses a keen understanding of markets, exchange rates, and the subtle art of negotiation. Now, imagine her leading her first major caravan east. The journey is a grueling test of endurance and nerve. She must manage dozens of men, hundreds of camels, and a cargo worth a fortune. She faces the constant threat of bandits, the treachery of the landscape, and the political instability of the petty kingdoms they pass through. Her social skills are as vital as her financial acumen. At each caravanserai, the fortified inns that were the social and economic hubs of the road, she must negotiate for provisions, pay for protection, and gather intelligence about the route ahead. She socializes, she bribes. She builds the relationships that are the true currency of the road. Finally, after months of travel, her caravan reaches the great oasis of Dunhuang, the gateway to China proper. While her cargo is being unloaded and taxed, she takes time to visit the nearby sacred site, the Magao Grottos, a cliff face honeycombed with hundreds of man-made caves. Inside, she steps out of the blinding desert sun and into another world. The caves are filled with breathtakingly vibrant murals depicting scenes from the life of the Buddha, celestial beings, and visions of paradise. The air is cool and thick with the scent of incense. She sees monks quietly chanting, transcribing holy texts onto long scrolls of paper. For Aisha, a pragmatic woman of commerce, this experience is profoundly moving. It speaks of a reality, a spiritual dimension that her worldly life has not accounted for. She is not seeking to convert, but she is deeply curious. Out of this curiosity, she uses a small portion of her profits to purchase a beautifully transcribed scroll of a Buddhist sutra. It is, for her, perhaps an exotic souvenir, a work of art, a token of a memorable journey. She packs it carefully among the bolts of silk for the long journey home. When she returns to Samarkand, the scroll is placed in her family's home. Perhaps it is read. Perhaps it is merely displayed. But it is present. It is a seed. And seeds like this, carried not by zealous missionaries, but by thousands of ordinary, curious, worldly people like Aisha, were planted in every oasis and city along the road. It was this mundane, human-scale process of exchange, repeated over and over, that truly powered the great transformations of the age. History is not only shaped by the grand gestures of the powerful, but by the quiet, cumulative choices of the many. Reflecting on this brings the ancient world into sharp, and perhaps uncomfortable, focus. The Silk Road's exchange of ideas feels so strikingly relevant. A new philosophy or religion spreading from city to city over the course of decades is, in essence, the ancient equivalent of a viral video or a new ideology spreading across social media in a matter of hours. The medium has changed from camel caravans to fiber optic cables, the speed from agonizingly slow to instantaneous, but the fundamental human dynamic is the same. Yet, I can't help but feel we've lost something profound in this acceleration. There was a friction to the ancient world that we have engineered away. The sheer difficulty of the journey, the time it took for a person or an idea to travel from one end of the network to the other, necessitated a level of commitment and reflection that is absent today. An idea that survived a journey across the Taklamakan Desert and the Pamir Mountains had to have real power. It had to be important enough for someone to risk their life to carry it. The adoption of a new faith or a new technology was a slow, deliberate process mulled over for generations. Aisha's story encapsulates this. Her physical journey across the continent was inseparable from her intellectual and spiritual encounter. The meaning of the scroll she carried was deepened by the memory of the desert sands and the mountain snows she had to cross to get it. Today, we can access any idea, any philosophy, any sacred text with a click. But in this frictionless world, does it carry the same weight? When information is abundant and cheap, does it devalue the very process of knowing? The Silk Road makes me wonder if the hardship of the journey was not an obstacle to connection, but an essential ingredient in making that connection meaningful. It suggests that the price of our modern, effortless connectivity might be a creeping sense of spiritual weightlessness. For centuries, the Silk Road was not a single entity, but a fractured dream, a web of pathways subject to the whims of 100 different kingdoms, sultanates, and nomadic tribes. To travel, it was to navigate a treacherous chessboard of shifting alliances and competing tariffs. A merchant leaving Persia might have to pay taxes to a dozen different warlords before reaching the borders of China. The great oasis cities, for all their splendor, were islands in a sea of uncertainty, vulnerable to the ambitions of each new regional power. The flow of goods and ideas, while persistent, was often a mere trickle, forced through a landscape of political friction. But in the early 13th century, a storm gathered on the high, cold steppes of Mongolia. It was a storm of humanity, a hurricane of horse and steel that would not just disrupt this fractured world, but utterly shatter it, and in doing so, paradoxically pave the way for the Silk Road's most astonishing and ultimately most tragic golden age. The storm had a name, Temujin. We know him as Genghis Khan. To understand the force he unleashed, you must first understand the world that created him. The Mongolian steppe was a brutal crucible. A land of climatic extremes, it forged a people of unparalleled resilience and hardiness. But it was also a world of endemic, self-destructive tribal warfare. Temujin was born into this chaos. His father was murdered, his family cast out and left to starve. He was hunted, enslaved, and betrayed. His early life was a relentless seminar in survival and the brutal realities of power. But within this boy, this outcast, was a revolutionary genius. He possessed a charisma that could bind men to him with unshakable loyalty and a strategic mind that saw beyond the petty squabbles of the clans. Through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance, he did what no one had thought possible. He unified the warring Mongol tribes into a single, disciplined nation. He shattered the old aristocratic order and replaced it with a meritocracy, promoting commanders based on skill and loyalty, not bloodline. He codified their laws in a system known as the Yasa, creating a unified legal framework for his new nation. He took the nomadic lifestyle, a perceived weakness, and weaponized it, turning his people into the most sophisticated and mobile military force the world had ever seen. The Mongol army was not a horde, it was a machine. Every man was a hunter, a rider, and a warrior from birth. Their composite bows could outrange their opponents. Their disciplined cavalry could perform complex maneuvers like the feigned retreat with lethal perfection, and their logistics were a marvel of efficiency. They were a nation on the march, and Genghis Khan now turned this incredible weapon upon the settled world. His gaze first fell upon the wealthy empires to the south and west. Yet, the initial Mongol expansion was not necessarily aimed at world conquest. It was driven by a need for resources and a desire to secure trade. The pivotal moment, the casus belli that unleashed the full fury of the Mongols upon the Islamic world, was a single, catastrophic act of hubris. Genghis Khan, seeing the value of trade, had sent a diplomatic and commercial mission to the powerful Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled much of Persia and Central Asia. In the frontier city of Otrar, the Khwarezmian governor, accusing the Mongol envoys of being spies, had them executed and their goods seized. When Genghis sent a second envoy to demand justice, the Shah of the Khwarezmian Empire had him killed as well, and his beard set on fire as a final insult. This was more than a crime. It was a violation of the sacred Mongol law protecting ambassadors. For Genghis Khan, it was an offense that could only be answered with annihilation. What followed was not a war. It was a judgment, a campaign of systematic terror and revenge on a scale that defies comprehension. The great and ancient cities of the Silk Road, which had for so long been centers of learning and commerce, were the first to be consumed by the firestorm. Bukhara, a city so resplendent it was known as the ornament of the world, was sacked. Genghis Khan himself rode his horse into the main mosque, declared himself the flail of God, and had its libraries of priceless manuscripts used as bedding for his horses. Samarkand, the jewel of Sogdiana, a city of magnificent mosques, observatories, and palaces, was taken and its population methodically massacred. In the city of Merv, a center of science and culture, the Persian historian Juvayni writes that a Muslim cleric spent 13 days counting the dead, arriving at a figure of 1,300,000 corpses. While likely an exaggeration, it speaks to the psychological shockwave of the invasion. The Mongols did not just conquer, they erased. They systematically destroyed the Qanat irrigation systems that had sustained life in the region for centuries, turning vast tracts of farmland back into desert. For the people living along the Silk Road, it must have seemed like the end of the world itself had arrived on horseback. And yet, from these bloody ashes rose something utterly unexpected. The Mongol conquests, for all their apocalyptic brutality, achieved what no emperor or caliph had ever managed before. They unified the world. Once the initial wave of destruction passed, the Mongol Empire became the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It stretched from the shores of the Pacific to the plains of Hungary, from the Siberian taiga to the Persian Gulf. For the first time, a single power controlled virtually the entire length of the Silk Road, and with this unification came a new kind of peace. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It was a peace born not of benevolence but of brutally efficient pragmatism. The Mongols were, at their core, administrators of a vast holding company. They had conquered the world, now they wanted to profit from it. And they quickly realized that the greatest source of wealth was not plunder, which was finite, but trade, which was renewable. To facilitate trade, they needed two things: security and speed. First, security. The Mongols established a level of law and order that was legendary. The old dangers of the road, the bandits, the warlords, the endless checkpoints were swept away. The punishment for banditry under the Yasa was death, and this was enforced without exception. The fear of Mongol retribution was so absolute that it created an unprecedented zone of safety. The 14th century Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta would later remark on this, and the saying became famous: a maiden carrying a nugget of gold on her head could wander safely from one end of the empire to the other. It was a peace enforced by the sword, an order maintained by terror, but for a merchant whose livelihood depended on the safe passage of his goods, it was a golden age. This new security was underpinned by a philosophy of remarkable tolerance. The Mongols themselves traditionally practiced a form of shamanism centered on the worship of Tengri, the eternal sky god, but they had little interest in imposing their beliefs on their conquered subjects. Their attitude was practical. As long as the local clerics, be they Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, or Taoist, were obedient and, most importantly, prayed for the health and long life of the great Khan, they were generally left alone. This policy not only prevented religious strife, but also allowed the Mongols to draw on the administrative and intellectual talents of all their subjects. A Muslim from Persia might serve as a governor in China. A Chinese engineer might be employed to build siege weapons in the Middle East. The Mongol court became one of the most cosmopolitan places on earth, a testament to their belief in using competence wherever they found it. But security was not enough. To truly make their empire function, they needed to conquer distance itself. And for this, they perfected an institution of logistical genius, the yam. The yam was the nervous system of the Mongol Empire. It was a vast network of relay stations, or erderer, established roughly every 20 to 30 miles along all the major routes. Each station was staffed and maintained by the local population, and was kept stocked with fresh horses, food, and lodging for authorized travelers. This was far more than a simple postal service. It was a system that enabled a breathtaking transfer of information and goods. An official decree from the Great Khan in the capital of Karakoram could reach the outer provinces in a matter of weeks, a journey that might have taken many months before. Military intelligence could be relayed with incredible speed, allowing the Khans to respond to threats and manage their vast domains. And crucially for our story, access to the yam was granted to merchants. For a fee, a trader could use the system, allowing him and his most valuable lightweight goods to travel at the speed of an official courier. This dramatically cut down on travel time, reduced costs, and revolutionized the pace of commerce. To access this system, a traveler needed proof of authority. This came in the form of the paisa, the Mongol passport. The paisa was not a flimsy piece of paper, but a tangible object of power. It was a tablet, usually made of wood, bronze, silver, or, for the highest-ranking individuals, solid gold. It was inscribed, often in multiple languages, with a promise of safe passage and a command for all local officials to provide the bearer with lodging, fresh horses, and whatever provisions they required. The paisa of a high-ranking envoy might even grant them the authority to command local resources. To hold a paisa was to hold a key that could unlock the entire continent. It was the physical embodiment of the new, interconnected world the Mongols had forged. It was a symbol that the old barriers had fallen, and the world was now open for business. The result of this security, speed, and openness was a flourishing of travel and trade unlike anything the world had ever seen. The 13th and early 14th centuries became the great age of the long-distance traveler. People, goods, and ideas flowed across Eurasia with unprecedented freedom. We can see this new reality through the eyes of those who lived it. Let's return to our fictional merchant, Khalid of Persia. A generation before, his grandfather's business would have been a high-risk venture, with profits constantly eroded by taxes, tariffs, and the threat of robbery. Under the Pax Mongolica, Khalid's world is transformed. He can now plan a caravan journey from Tabriz to Khanbalik, modern Beijing, with a level of certainty his ancestors could only dream of. He no longer fears bandits. He pays a single, predictable tax to the Mongol authorities. He can send his most trusted agent ahead on the YAM system, carrying market-sensitive information or rare gems, ensuring they arrive weeks or even months ahead of the main caravan. This allows him to react to market changes with incredible speed, almost like a primitive form of a modern futures trader. His family's business doesn't just survive under the Mongols, it thrives, reaching a scale and profitability that was previously unimaginable. The Mongols, the former destroyers of cities, have become the guarantors of his prosperity. It was this environment that made the most famous of all Silk Road journeys possible, that of the Polos. When Niccolo and Maffei Polo, and later Niccolo's son Marco, made their epic journey from Venice to China, they were not traveling into a complete unknown. They were traveling within a system. The Mongol-controlled lands they passed through were safe. The Pesa they were granted by Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis and ruler of the Yuan dynasty in China, gave them unparalleled access and authority. Marco Polo's famous account, The Travels, provides a European's astonished perspective on the sophistication and scale of the Mongol world. He describes the grandeur of Kublai Khan's court at Xanadu, a place of immense wealth and cosmopolitanism, where he saw merchants and advisors from all corners of the known world. He marveled at the use of paper money, a concept centuries ahead of Europe. He described the efficient burning of black stones, coal for fuel. He was stunned by the sheer size and organization of cities like Hangzhou. While some modern scholars question the details of his account, its overall thrust is undeniable. It revealed to a still provincial Europe a vision of a distant world that was, in many ways, more advanced and better organized than their own. The Polos were not solitary adventurers in a wilderness. They were participants in a Mongol-managed system of globalization. But to truly appreciate the multidirectional nature of this exchange, we must look at the mirror image of Marco Polo, the incredible and tragically lesser-known journey of Rabban Bar Sama. While Polo, a Latin Christian, traveled from west to east, Rabban Sama, a Nestorian Christian, traveled from east to west. He was born in the 1220s near Khanbalik, the Mongol capital of China. He was an ethnic Ongud, a Turkic people, and became a prominent monk in the Church of the East. In the 1280, the Mongol Ilkhan of Persia, Arghun Khan, sought an alliance with the Christian kings of Europe against their common enemy, the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. For this critical diplomatic mission, he needed an envoy who could bridge the cultural gap. He chose Rabban Sama. And so this monk from China embarked on an incredible diplomatic journey. He traveled from Persia to Constantinople, then on to Italy. In Rome, he met with the College of Cardinals. The papacy was vacant at the time. He then traveled to Paris, where he met with King Philip Roman IV of France, and to Gascony, where he met with King Edward I of England. Think of it. A man born in Beijing, speaking a Turkic language, representing a Mongol Khan from Persia, celebrating his own distinct form of Christian liturgy before the kings of medieval Europe. His journey is the ultimate proof of the Pax Mongolica's power. It was a world so interconnected that a man from Khanbalik could have a serious diplomatic negotiation with the King of England. The Silk Road was no longer a one-way street for Eastern luxuries to trickle into Europe. It had become a true global highway, a two-way conduit for diplomacy, religion, and culture. For a fleeting century, the world was more connected than it had ever been, or would be again until the age of the steamship. The Mongol enforced peace had created a golden age of exchange. A merchant in Genoa could wear silk from Suzhou. A Khan in Beijing could dine with a European advisor. A monk from China could debate theology with a pope in Rome. It was a world of incredible dynamism and possibility. But the system's greatest strength was also its most profound weakness. The network was too good, too efficient. The very pathways that carried silk, spices, and missionaries with such incredible speed and safety could also carry other, more sinister passengers. The constant movement of people, of armies, of caravans, of livestock, created the perfect conditions for the transmission of pathogens across a continent that now had no immunological firewalls. The Yam system, that marvel of imperial logistics, was an ideal vector for a disease to spread from one end of the empire to the other with terrifying velocity. The prosperity of the Pax Mongolica was a fragile blossom, grown in soil fertilized by conquest, and hidden within the intricate web of its connections, a microscopic traveler was beginning its own journey. It carried no pesa. It sought no profit. It was an agent of pure biology, and it was about to exploit this new, unified world with an efficiency that would have impressed the great Khan himself. The golden age of connection was about to give way to an age of contagion. The same roads that brought the world together were about to unleash the greatest catastrophe in human history. The world the Mongols made was a marvel of human ingenuity, a vast, unified space where for the first time in history, a traveler could journey from the China Sea to the heart of Europe under the protection of a single, overarching authority. The Pax Mongolica was the apex of overland connectivity, a golden age of communication and commerce. But every system, no matter how perfectly designed, contains the seeds of its own undoing. And the very efficiency of the Mongol network, its greatest triumph, would become the conduit for its most catastrophic failure. The web that had carried merchants, missionaries, and diplomats with such unprecedented speed was about to transmit something else, an invisible passenger, a biological stowaway that had been waiting for millennia for a world connected enough to become its prey. The story of the mid-14th century is the story of this invisible traveler. It is the story of how the arteries of globalism became the vectors of apocalypse. The agent of this catastrophe was a bacterium of terrifying elegance and lethality, Yersinia pestis. It is a master of survival, a microscopic predator that lives in a complex ancient cycle. Its primary host is a rodent, and its chariot is the flea, specifically the oriental rat flea, Xenopsilla chiopes. When a flea bites an infected rodent, the bacteria multiply rapidly inside the flea's gut, forming a biofilm that blocks its digestive tract. Starving and desperate, the flea bites new hosts with increasing frenzy, and in its attempts to feed, it regurgitates a slurry of bacteria directly into the victim's bloodstream. The flea becomes a perfect, living syringe, injecting doom with every bite. For thousands of years, Yersinia pestis existed in what are known as natural plague reservoirs, isolated ecosystems where the bacteria circulate among rodent populations, like marmots, with only occasional, limited spillovers to humans. One of the most significant of these reservoirs lies on the high grasslands of Central Asia, near Lake Issyk-Kul in modern-day Kyrgyzstan. Archaeologists have unearthed a haunting clue, a Nestorian Christian cemetery where the tombstones from the years 1338 and 1,339 record an abnormally high number of deaths. Uniquely, several of these stones are explicitly inscribed with the cause of death, pestilence. This is the first whisper of the coming storm, the ground zero of the pandemic. So what caused the jump? How did this ancient, localized cycle break its banks and flood the world? We don't know for certain, but the likeliest cause is a perfect storm of ecological change and human connection. A period of abrupt climate change in Central Asia may have disrupted the marmot populations, causing them to die off and forcing their hungry fleas to find new hosts. These new hosts were the ubiquitous black rats, Rattus rattus, that had become the constant, unseen companions of human travel and trade. They were in the grain shipments, in the storage depots of the caravanserai, and nestled in the cargo holds of every merchant caravan. The rat was the perfect stowaway, and so the fateful intersection occurred. The ancient biological cycle of Yersinia pestis collided with the new, hyper-efficient transportation network of the Pax Mongolica. The infected rat, carrying its cargo of infected fleas, hopped aboard a caravan. The journey that would have once been impossible, a series of disconnected and difficult stages, was now a swift, protected passage along the Yam system. The plague was now mobile, and it began to travel east into China and west towards the Middle East and Europe with the full speed and efficiency of the Mongol Empire behind it. Its arrival in Europe is the subject of a story so dramatic it feels like a dark legend. In 1346, the Mongol army of the Golden Horde was laying siege to the Genos trading port of Kaffa, a bustling hub on the Crimean Peninsula. During the siege, the Mongol army was struck down by the mysterious and terrifying new disease. Their soldiers died in droves, in an act of desperate, diabolical ingenuity, perhaps one of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare. The Mongol commander ordered the corpses of his plague victims to be loaded onto catapults and hurled over the city walls. The rotting bodies rained down on the Genos defenders, who were horrified to find themselves afflicted with the same sickness. A handful of Genos trading ships managed to escape the dying city, their holds filled with goods, with rats, and with the plague itself. These ships became floating coffins, spreading the pestilence to every port they touched. They arrived in Constantinople, then Messina in Sicily, then Genoa and Marseille. From these great maritime hubs, the plague poured into the European continent, racing along the well-established trade routes, the very arteries that had brought Europe its prosperity. The Black Death had arrived. The disease itself was a monster of horrifying versatility. It manifested in three primary forms. The most common was the bubonic plague, named for the agonizingly painful swellings, or buboes, that appeared in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpits, and neck. These swellings would grow to the size of an egg or an apple, turning a dark, purplish black as the tissue beneath became necrotic. The onset was violent, a sudden fever, shaking chills, vomiting, and delirium. The pain was said to be excruciating. If the buboes didn't burst and drain, death usually followed within a week. But if the infection bypassed the lymph system and entered the lungs, it became the far more virulent pneumonic plague. This form was transmitted directly from person to person through airborne droplets from a cough. It required no rats, no fleas. It was as contagious as a common cold and as deadly as a gunshot wound. The victim's lungs would essentially liquefy, and they would die drowning in their own bloody fluid, almost always within 2 or 3 days. It was this form that allowed the plague to spread with such terrifying speed during the cold European winters when rats were less active. The third form was the most terrifying of all, septicemic plague. In these cases, the bacteria multiplied directly and overwhelmingly in the bloodstream. The victim's blood would be so saturated with Yersinia pestis that their skin would darken from subcutaneous hemorrhages, likely giving the Black Death its name. Death was shockingly swift, often occurring in a matter of hours, sometimes before any of the classic bubonic or pneumonic symptoms even had a chance to appear. A man could go to bed healthy and be found dead in the morning. The plague's march across Eurasia was relentless, a systematic erasure of humanity. From Italy, it swept north into France, Spain, and England, arriving there in 1348. By 1349, it had engulfed Germany and Scandinavia. By 1351, it had reached the vast plains of Russia. It was not just a European event. It devastated the Middle East, where chroniclers in Cairo and Damascus wrote of apocalyptic scenes, of cities whose populations were halved. The Mongol heartlands were ravaged. The world that had been so proudly and brutally unified by the Khans was now being systematically dismembered by a microbe. The infrastructure of connection had become the architecture of death. As the body count mounted into the unimaginable tens of millions, the very fabric of society began to unravel. This was more than a demographic crisis. It was a psychological and spiritual cataclysm. How does the human mind process a world where death is not just a possibility, but a statistical probability, where the air itself seems to carry a fatal poison? The first casualty was trust. Neighbors feared neighbors. Parents abandoned their sick children. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague, wrote in his masterpiece, The Decameron, that such terror was struck into the hearts of men and women that brother forsook brother, uncle nephew, sister brother, and oftentimes wife her husband. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited to their fate. Faith was shaken to its core. Pious prayers went unanswered as the good and the wicked were struck down with equal indifference. Why was God allowing this? For many, the only answer was that this was divine punishment for the sins of mankind, a biblical apocalypse made real. This belief gave rise to the flagellant movement, groups of religious fanatics who marched from town to town, whipping themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes in public displays of penance. Believing their self-inflicted suffering could appease God's wrath, while they were initially greeted as holy men, they soon became another vector for the plague, spreading the disease from one community to the next. When prayers failed, people turned to rage and blame. In a desperate search for a scapegoat, communities across Europe turned on their Jewish neighbors. Vicious rumors spread that the Jews had caused the plague by poisoning the wells. This led to horrific pogroms. Entire Jewish populations in cities like Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne were rounded up and burned alive. They were murdered for a crime they did not commit, victims of a fear and ignorance as deadly as the plague itself. The machinery of civilization ground to a halt. Doctors and priests who were on the front lines died in staggering numbers. Many more simply refused to treat the sick or give last rites, fearing for their own lives. The economy collapsed as trade ceased and fields lay fallow. The sheer number of corpses overwhelmed the living. Normal funerary rites became an impossible luxury. Bodies were left in the streets or dragged from houses and thrown into mass graves, vast pits dug outside the city walls, where the dead were layered like lasagna in a pan, as one chronicler grimly put it. To understand this collapse on a human level, let's imagine the world through the eyes of our fictional character, Elena. Let's place her not in Palmyra, but in the bustling, cosmopolitan port city of Genoa in 1347. As the daughter of a wealthy merchant, her life has been one of comfort and privilege, her world enriched by the very connectivity of the sea. Her father's ships bring silk from the Black Sea ports, spices from Alexandria, and wealth from across the known world. She first hears of the pestilence as a strange rumor, a sailor's tale from the distant east, but then the fleeing ships from Kaffa limp into the harbor. Soon, the dock workers are falling ill. The disease creeps into the city, from the crowded sailors' quarters into the wealthy merchant districts. The church bells, which once marked the hours of the day, now toll ceaselessly for the dead, until there are no healthy bell ringers left to pull the ropes, and an eerie silence falls over the city. Elena watches her world invert. The social bonds she took for granted dissolve into an acid bath of fear. She sees neighbors barricade themselves in their homes. She witnesses the horror of the plague firsthand as it claims her own family, her father, her brothers, their bodies racked with fever and marked by the terrifying black buboes. She survives, but she is now an heiress to a ghost town, a queen of a charnel house. The very ships that brought her family their fortune have delivered their doom. The open world she once celebrated now seems like a fatal design flaw, a source not of wonder, but of unimaginable grief. Her survival is tainted by a profound and bitter question. What is the point of a world so connected if that connection brings only ruin? The Black Death eventually burned itself out, but it left behind a changed world. The scale of the demographic collapse is still difficult to fathom. Modern estimates suggest that Europe lost somewhere between 30% and 60% of its entire population. Some regions were hit even harder. The Middle East suffered comparable losses. The world was emptier, quieter, and profoundly traumatized. This cataclysm marked the definitive end of an era. The Mongol Empire, which had already been showing signs of fragmentation, was dealt a mortal blow. The Yuan dynasty in China, crippled by the plague and the ensuing social chaos, was overthrown by a native Chinese rebellion in 1368, replaced by the isolationist Ming dynasty. The Mongol Khanates in Persia and Russia saw their power crumble, their populations decimated, their trade routes shattered. The Pax Mongolica, the great system of security and travel that had acted as the plague's superhighway, was itself one of the plague's most significant victims. The world was slammed shut, and yet in the grim calculus of history, great destruction can sometimes lead to unforeseen creation. In Europe, the massive loss of life had revolutionary consequences. With as much as half the workforce gone, the value of labor skyrocketed. For the first time, common peasants and laborers had real bargaining power. They could demand higher wages, better conditions, and greater freedom. The old feudal system of serfdom, which tied peasants to the land, began to disintegrate. This great social and economic rebalancing helped lay the groundwork for a more dynamic, market-based European economy. The psychological shock also challenged the unquestioned authority of the old institutions, particularly the church. The intellectual ferment and questioning of tradition that arose from the ashes of the plague are seen by many historians as a critical catalyst for the cultural rebirth of the Renaissance. In the end, the story of the Black Death is more than just a grim chapter of medieval history. It is a timeless and terrifying echo. Living through the COVID-19 pandemic, we have tasted a faint, modern version of its story. We saw the same pattern, the early rumors from a distant city, the lightning-fast global transmission via our modern YAM system of international air travel, the lockdowns, the economic paralysis, the fear, the scapegoating, and the sudden, humbling realization of our interconnected vulnerability. The Black Death stands as the ultimate testament to the double-edged sword of globalization. It reveals the fundamental paradox of the human condition, our greatest strength, our relentless drive to connect, to trade, to explore, and to build vast, complex systems will forever be shadowed by the risks inherent in that very connection. The Silk Road and the Mongol peace that perfected it brought the world together in an unprecedented embrace, but that embrace proved to be a fatal one. It taught us a lesson that we are forced to relearn, generation after generation, that the threads that weave our world together can, in an instant, become the very snares that threaten to tear it all apart. The Black Death was a full stop at the end of an age. The world that emerged from its shadow was a haunted and fractured place. The great unifying force of the Pax Mongolica was shattered, its successor khanates collapsing into infighting and civil war. The overland routes of the Silk Road, once policed by the terrifying certainty of Mongol power, once again became a treacherous and uncertain proposition. Banditry returned. The great caravanserai fell into disrepair. The political landscape, once a single, contiguous entity, was now a broken mosaic of suspicious, hostile states. To travel the old roads was to risk not only robbery and violence, but also the lingering ghost of the plague itself, a psychological barrier that was, perhaps, even more formidable than any mountain pass or desert. The great terrestrial artery of the planet had clotted. The world, it seemed, was shutting down. But the human impulse to connect, to trade, to seek what lies beyond the horizon is not so easily extinguished. It is a force of nature in its own right. When one path closes, another opens. And as the overland routes withered, humanity's gaze turned, as it had done many times before, to the sea. The oceans had always been there, a parallel network of exchange, a slower but steadier pulse. Roman ships had sailed to India 1,000 years earlier, guided by the maps and manuals of the periplus of the Erythraean Sea. Austronesian sailors had performed miracles of navigation across the Pacific. Arab and Persian merchants had long stitched together the coastlines of the Indian Ocean. But now, in the 15th century, the sea was no longer the alternative. It was about to become the main stage. The focus of global history was about to pivot away from the dusty deserts of Central Asia and onto the vast, blue horizon of the open ocean. The engine of this new world was a force of planetary scale, the monsoon. For 6 months of the year, the winds blew reliably from the southwest, allowing ships to sail with ease from the coast of Africa and the Middle East to India and Southeast Asia. Then, for the other 6 months, the winds would reverse, blowing from the northeast, providing a natural, predictable conveyor belt to carry those same ships home again. To master the monsoon was to hold the key to the Indian Ocean. It was nature itself providing the timetable for global commerce. This new age required new technologies, new vessels designed to conquer the waves. From the ports of the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf came the dhow, a marvel of naval architecture. With its triangular lateen sail, it possessed the remarkable ability to sail much closer to the wind than square-rigged ships, granting it immense flexibility and range. Its hull was often constructed not with nails, but with planks stitched together with coir rope, a technique that gave the vessel a unique flexibility, allowing it to absorb the shock of rough seas and coral reefs where a more rigid ship might shatter. But the true masters of the sea, the builders of the most technologically advanced ships on the planet, were the Chinese. For centuries they had been perfecting the junk, a vessel that was, in every respect, superior to its contemporaries. They had invented the stern-mounted rudder, which provided far more effective steering than the simple steering oars used in the West. Most importantly, they had perfected the use of watertight bulkheads. The interior of a junk's hull was divided into separate, sealed compartments. If the hull was breached in one section, the water would be contained and the ship would not sink. It was a revolutionary safety feature that European shipbuilders would not adopt for another 400 years. These ships, technologically superior and built on a scale that dwarfed all others, were poised to dominate this new maritime age. This shift from land to sea also triggered a fundamental shift in the nature of the cargo itself. The old Silk Road, with its reliance on pack animals, was best suited for goods with a high value-to-weight ratio: silk, gemstones, lightweight luxury items. The sea was different. A single ship could carry more cargo than 1,000 camels. This made the transport of heavy, bulk goods profitable for the first time on a global scale. Vast quantities of Chinese porcelain, the white gold that had become an object of obsession in Persia and the Middle East, could now be shipped by the ton. Spices, rice, timber, cotton, and other commodities could be moved across the ocean with an efficiency that was simply impossible over land. The maritime world was not just a new route, it was a new economic model, a shift from the trade of rare luxuries to the beginnings of a true global trade in commodities. For a brief, incandescent moment at the beginning of the 15th century, it seemed that China was destined to become the master of this new world. The catalyst was the ambition of a single man, the Yongle Emperor, the third ruler of the new Ming dynasty. He was a usurper who had taken the throne by force, and he was consumed with a need to legitimize his rule and project an image of overwhelming power. He moved the capital to Beijing and began construction of the Forbidden City. He commissioned massive intellectual projects like the Yongle Encyclopedia, and he unleashed the most spectacular display of naval power the world had ever seen. He decided to send a series of massive fleets out into the Indian Ocean, not to conquer, but to command. To lead these expeditions, he chose a remarkable individual, a court eunuch named Zhang He. Zhang He's story is a testament to the complexities of the Ming court. He was not a member of the traditional Han Chinese elite. He was a Hui, a member of China's Muslim minority. As a boy, his hometown had been captured by Ming armies, and he was taken as a prisoner, castrated, and sent to serve in the court of a prince, the very prince who would become the Yongle Emperor. Zhang He grew to be a physically imposing and highly capable leader, and he became the emperor's most trusted advisor. His Muslim background and familiarity with the languages and customs of the West made him the perfect diplomat for this grand oceanic undertaking. What he commanded was, by any standard, staggering. These were not fleets, they were floating cities. On his first voyage in 1405, Zhang He commanded a flotilla of over 300 ships, crewed by nearly 28,000 men. For comparison, 87 years later, Christopher Columbus would cross the Atlantic with 3 small ships and a crew of 90. The flagships of Zhang He's armada were the legendary Baochuan, or treasure ships. While their exact size is still debated by scholars, contemporary Chinese accounts describe them as colossal vessels, perhaps over 400 feet long and 170 feet wide, with 9 masts and 12 sails. These were the largest ships built anywhere in the world until the age of steel in the 19th century. But the fleet was more than just its giant flagships. It was a fully integrated naval task force. There were horse ships to carry cavalry and tribute animals, supply ships laden with grain and provisions, water tankers providing fresh water for the thousands of men, and troop transports carrying a significant military force. This was not an exploration in the European sense, a desperate gamble into the unknown. This was the projection of a superpower, a perfectly organized and self-sufficient expedition designed to display China's wealth, technology, and military might to the entire known world. Between 1405 and 1433, Zhang He led 7 of these epic voyages. They sailed to the great trading hubs of Southeast Asia, to Calicut and the other kingdoms of India, to the Persian Gulf port of Hormuz, and all the way down the east coast of Africa, reaching as far as Malindi in modern-day Kenya. Their purpose was not territorial conquest. It was a form of soft power on a grand scale. The fleets would arrive in a foreign port, their immense size and disciplined crews an awe-inspiring spectacle. Zhang He would then engage in diplomacy, transmitting the Yongle emperor's demand that the local ruler acknowledge the Chinese emperor as the son of heaven and enter into China's tribute system. This was less about subjugation and more about establishing the proper world order, with China at its undisputed center. Gifts were exchanged: Chinese silk, porcelain, and lacquerware for local rarities and exotic creatures. It was on one of these voyages that the fleet brought back a giraffe from Africa, which was presented at the Ming court and celebrated as the mythical Qilin, a magical beast whose appearance was a sign of a wise and benevolent ruler. To understand the impact of these voyages, we must try to see them not from a Chinese perspective, but from the perspective of the world they encountered. Let's imagine our fictional Arab sailor Malik. We'll place him not on the fleet itself, but as an experienced local pilot in the Indian port of Calicut. He has spent his life on the sea, and he believes he knows what a ship is. He has sailed dhows across the Arabian Sea, and he has seen merchant junks from China before. But nothing can prepare him for the day Zhang He's fleet appears on the horizon. It is not a fleet, it is a forest of masts. The ships are so large they seem to defy the laws of nature, their 9-masted treasure ships making his own vessel feel like a child's toy. When they drop anchor, the disciplined routine of the nearly 30,000 men, the sheer logistical perfection of it all, is a display of power far beyond anything he has ever witnessed. He is hired as a navigator to help guide a portion of the fleet further west, and he steps aboard a world of wonders. He is awed by the compasses used for navigation, the watertight security of the hull, and the sheer abundance of the provisions. He travels with them to the ports of Africa. He witnesses the Chinese diplomatic rituals, the exchange of precious goods, the shock and awe that the fleet inspires in every port. He sees that the Chinese are not there to conquer in the way a land army would. They do not need to. Their power is self-evident. They are there to organize the world, to bring it into their orbit, to demonstrate that the Son of Heaven in Beijing is the ultimate arbiter of global affairs. For Malik, it is a profound realization. He is witnessing the dawn of a new age, an age of oceanic connection, and it is clear to him, as it must have been to everyone who saw the treasure fleets, that China was its ordained master. He returns home with stories that sound like fables, convinced that the future of the world will be written in Chinese characters on the waves of the Indian Ocean. And then it stopped. In one of the most stunning and consequential reversals in all of history, China, at the absolute zenith of its maritime power, deliberately and systematically turned its back on the sea. The great fleets were dismantled, their crews dispersed, their technologies forgotten. It was a voluntary act of civilizational suicide. The reasons were complex: a perfect storm of political infighting, philosophical conviction, and strategic recalculation. The great champion of the voyages, the Yongle Emperor, died in 1424. His successors lacked his vision and his expansionist drive. They were faced with a renewed military threat from the Mongols on the northern land frontier, a threat that seemed far more immediate and real than the distant politics of the Indian Ocean. Furthermore, the voyages were astronomically expensive. At the Ming court, a powerful and deeply conservative bureaucracy of Confucian scholar officials had long viewed the expeditions with suspicion. To the Confucian mindset, commerce was a lowly pursuit, and foreign entanglements were a dangerous distraction from the proper governance of the Middle Kingdom itself. They saw the fleets as a colossal vanity project, a drain on the treasury that would be better spent on domestic projects like the Grand Canal, and most importantly, on reinforcing the Great Wall to defend against the Mongols. The eunuchs like Zhang Qian, who led the expeditions, were the political rivals of the scholar officials. For the bureaucracy, dismantling the fleets was not just a policy decision, it was a political victory. And so the edicts came down. The voyages were terminated. A ban was placed on the construction of any new ocean-going ships. In one of the greatest tragedies for history, court officials, seeking to erase the legacy of the eunuchs, systematically sought out and destroyed most of the official records and charts from Zhang He's voyages. An entire chapter of global exploration, arguably the most advanced of its time, was deliberately thrown onto the bonfire. China closed its gates. This great retreat created a power vacuum of immense proportions in the Indian Ocean. The meticulously managed system of trade and tribute that Zhang He had established simply evaporated. The seas, for a time, became a no-man's land, but power vacuums do not last long, and into this void, a new and aggressive player was about to arrive. Less than 60 years after Zhang He's last fleet returned to China, a small squadron of 3 Portuguese ships, battered by their journey and minuscule by Chinese standards, rounded the Cape of Good Hope. They were led by Vasco da Gama. They were not seeking tribute, they were seeking spices and souls. And they came armed not just with navigational charts, but with cannons and a ruthless willingness to use them. They entered an Indian Ocean where the previous naval superpower had simply vanished, having abdicated its role on the world stage. The Portuguese and the European powers that followed them did not have to defeat the Chinese navy to control the seas of Asia. They just had to show up. This moment is one of the great hinges of history. What if China had not turned back? What if the treasure fleets had continued to sail, perhaps even rounding Africa and sailing up the coast of Europe? A fleet of Chinese giants appearing in the Tagus River estuary decades before Vasco da Gama even set sail. The entire trajectory of the modern world, the rise of the West, the age of colonialism, might have been completely different. It is a profound and sobering lesson in the nature of power. It reminds us that history is often shaped not by bold actions, but by failures of nerve, by choices not taken. The closing of the Dragon's Gate was a retreat from the world, and in doing so, China ceded the future of globalization to the small, hungry, and ambitious nations of Western Europe. The maritime age would continue, but its destiny would now be forged in the shipyards of Lisbon and Amsterdam, not the great docks of Nanjing. To journey along the Silk Road, even if only in spirit, is to realize that you are not walking through a dead and dusty history. You are navigating a living text, a vast and intricate parable written across deserts and mountains, in the rise and fall of empires, and in the quiet, tenacious transactions of ordinary people. Its stories are not relics, they are mirrors. And if we look closely enough, we can see the reflection of our own world, our own challenges, and our own potential, written in a language of silk and sand, of faith and fear. The lessons of this ancient network are not footnotes to the past, they are urgent messages for the present. The first and most fundamental lesson is that connection is the engine of creation. Innovation, it turns out, is not a solitary act. It is not born in a vacuum. It happens at the crossroads, at the frayed edges where different worlds, different ideas, and different ways of being collide. It is a process of creative friction. Consider the stunning Greco-Buddhist art of Gandhara. This was not simply a case of Greek statues being placed in Buddhist temples. It was a true synthesis, a third thing, a new reality born from the encounter. The humanistic, corporeal, artistic genius of the West, a legacy of Alexander, was infused with the profound, introspective philosophy of the East. The result was an image of the Buddha that was both divine and deeply human, an artistic language that allowed Buddhism to speak to and ultimately convert millions. The idea became flesh, and it did so at a cultural intersection. This principle echoes through the centuries. Take the journey of paper. In China, it was a brilliant but largely domestic tool for a sprawling bureaucracy. But when the knowledge of its creation traveled west along the Silk Road, it collided with other cultures at their moments of greatest need. In the Islamic Golden Age, this cheap, abundant medium became the vehicle for a revolution in science, mathematics, and philosophy. As the great works of the ancient world were translated, debated, and expanded upon in the libraries of Baghdad and Cordoba. Millennia later, when paper finally permeated Europe, it arrived just in time to fuel the printing press, becoming the literal page upon which the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution were written. The technology itself was potent, but its world-changing power was only unlocked when it was plugged into the intellectual and spiritual needs of a different civilization. The Silk Road teaches us that progress is combinatorial. The future is rarely invented from whole cloth. It is almost always assembled from the pieces of a connected present. The second lesson is etched into the very fabric of the journey itself. Resilience is the signature of the human spirit. The story of the Silk Road is not a gentle tale of ever-increasing prosperity. It is a chronicle of brutal, relentless adversity and the astonishing human capacity to endure, adapt, and rebuild. Its heroes are not always the conquerors, but the survivors. We see it in the figure of Zhang Qian. His story is not defined by his mission's success, but by his resilience in its failure. His decade in Xingnu captivity was not a pause in his journey. It was the crucible that forged its meaning. His endurance was not a passive waiting, but an active process of learning, of observing, of holding onto a core purpose while fully inhabiting a hostile world. He survived, but more than that, he prevailed, turning an ordeal into an opportunity that would alter the course of history. We see this same resilience on a terrifyingly larger scale in the aftermath of the Black Death, a catastrophe that erased as much as half the population of Eurasia. Should have been an extinction-level event for civilization. And for a time, it was. Society broke down, faith wavered, the world seemed to be sinking into a terminal darkness. And yet it did not end. The survivors, haunted and diminished, eventually began to rebuild, and in the rebuilding, something new emerged. In Europe, the old, rigid structures of feudalism, already strained, were shattered by the demographic collapse. The sudden scarcity of labor gave common people a form of leverage they had never possessed, leading to social and economic revolutions that were unimaginable a century before. The lesson here is profound. Resilience is not merely the ability to bounce back to the way things were, True resilience is the capacity to be broken by hardship and then to reassemble the pieces into something new, something stronger. It is the alchemy of turning trauma into transformation. This leads to a third, and perhaps more contentious, lesson for our modern world. Diversity is the non-negotiable prerequisite for prosperity. The great cities of the Silk Road, Chang'an, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, were not great because they were ethnically or culturally pure. They were great precisely because they were not. They were cosmopolitan melting pots, vibrant, chaotic, and teeming with difference. To walk through the marketplace of Samarkand at its zenith would be to immerse yourself in a living library of humanity. You would hear the Iranian tongue of the Sogdians, the lingua franca of the road, mingling with Persian, Chinese, Turkic, Arabic, and Sanskrit. You would see merchants haggling over goods from every corner of the known world. You would find a Buddhist monastery a short walk from a Nestorian Christian church, a Zoroastrian fire temple, or a Jewish synagogue. This pluralism was not merely a colorful feature. It was the city's core economic and intellectual engine. It created a marketplace not just of goods, but of ideas, of technologies, of solutions. It fostered a tolerance born not necessarily of high-minded philosophy, but of practical necessity. When your city's survival depends on long-distance trade, you learn to do business with people who do not look, speak, or pray as you do. The Silk Road stands as a massive, thousand-year-long refutation of the idea that strength lies in homogeneity. It demonstrates, again and again, that monocultures are brittle and fragile. The most robust, innovative, and prosperous systems are those that are diverse, interconnected, and open to the cross-pollination of outside influence. In an age where walls are once again becoming a political fashion, the ruins of these great, open cities offer a silent but powerful warning. Finally, the Silk Road forces us to confront the most difficult lesson, the central paradox of our own globalized age. You must balance the immense rewards of connection against its inherent, and sometimes terrible, risks. Openness is not a simple, unalloyed good. The same pathways that carry knowledge and prosperity can also carry destruction. The Black Death is the ultimate, horrific proof of this principle. The Pax Mongolica created a golden age of secure and efficient trade. It was a marvel of pre-modern globalization, and that very success, that very efficiency, is precisely what allowed Yersinia pestis to race across the continent and kill tens of millions. The blessing was the curse. The system's greatest strength was its most fatal vulnerability. They were two sides of the same coin, inextricably linked. There is no version of the story where you get the flourishing of the 13th century without the risk of the catastrophe of the 14th. This is the great dilemma that history has bequeathed to us. An open internet connects and empowers us, but it also becomes a conduit for disinformation and radicalization. Global air travel enriches our lives and economies, but it can spread a novel virus around the planet in a matter of days. To choose connection is to choose risk. The temptation, then, when faced with the dangers, is to do what the Ming Dynasty did, to turn inward, to shut the gates, to sever the connections. But the story of the Ming retreat is a cautionary tale. In their quest for stability and security, they abdicated their role on the world stage and ceded the future to others. The true lesson of the Silk Road, then, is not to seek a risk-free world by closing ourselves off. It is to have the wisdom and foresight to understand that risk is the price of connection. It compels us to build systems that are not just efficient, but also resilient. It demands that we invest in the intellectual and social equivalents of public health infrastructure, creating antibodies against the dangerous ideologies that travel the same networks as our commerce and culture. It asks us to manage the paradox, to live with the tension, to embrace the immense, creative power of an open world while never forgetting the profound responsibilities that come with it. The Silk Road is not a simple story with a happy ending. It is a complex, often tragic, but ultimately hopeful testament to the enduring human project of reaching out, of building bridges, and of navigating the magnificent and dangerous consequences of touching the world. There is a temptation when a story is over to place it carefully in the past, to treat it as a finished artifact, a relic to be examined under glass, separate from the messy, urgent reality of our own lives. But the Silk Road resists this confinement. To consign it to history is to miss its most vital and unsettling lesson. The story is not over. The Silk Road is not a memory. It is a ghost that still haunts our global machine. It is a foundational operating system that runs silently in the background of our 21st century world, its ancient logic shaping the pathways of our modern commerce, our politics, and our very consciousness. Our world is a palimpsest, a manuscript written over and over, but if you look closely with the right kind of light, you can still see the faint, indelible traces of the original text, the text of the Silk Road. Its most obvious legacy is written in concrete, steel, and glass. The physical pathways, the desire lines carved into the earth by centuries of human ambition, are still there. They have simply been paved over, widened, and renamed. The old Roman roads in the West that fed into the network are now the foundations for modern superhighways, where caravans of trucks have replaced caravans of camels. The treacherous mountain passes through the Caucasus, and the Hindu Kush are now pierced by tunnels and spanned by engineering marvels, but the strategic choke points remain the same. The geography has not changed, and the paths of least resistance are eternal. Today we speak of the new Iron Silk Road, a web of transcontinental railways that thunder across the Eurasian landmass. A freight train, stretching for a mile and carrying hundreds of shipping containers, can now make the journey from Yiwu in China to Madrid in Spain in just over 2 weeks. It is a miracle of modern logistics. But is it new, or is it simply the ultimate evolution of the Bactrian camel caravan, carrying 1,000 times the cargo at 100 times the speed, but driven by the exact same commercial impulse? The scale is different, the technology is different, but the fundamental logic is identical. It is still about moving goods from the workshops of the East to the markets of the West across the great landmass of Asia. The ghost of the road lives on in the rhythm of the iron wheels. The transformation is even more profound on the sea. The ancient maritime routes, first navigated by the predictable monsoon winds, are now the superhighways of global shipping. The same sea lanes that carried Roman pottery, Arab dhows, and the colossal treasure fleets of Zhang Qian are now plied by ultra-large container vessels, floating leviathans the length of 4 football fields, carrying the entire material culture of our age. A smartphone assembled in Shenzhen, a pair of sneakers from Vietnam, a car from South Korea, they all travel these same pathways. They pass through the same strategic maritime choke points like the Strait of Malacca that were the epicenters of the old spice trade. The journey is faster, the ships are larger, the cargo is different, but the map itself is hauntingly familiar. And what of the most important cargo, the ideas, the information, the data? The transmission of a single Buddhist sutra from India to China was a journey of years, a perilous undertaking requiring immense devotion. Today, that same text, digitized into bits of light, can be sent to every corner of the planet in less than a second. It travels through fiber optic cables that lie on the ocean floor, often following the very same coastal contours as the ancient sea routes. The exchange of knowledge, once a process of heroic, human-scale effort, has become instantaneous, ethereal, and omnipresent. The network has evolved from a physical path to a metaphysical field. This is the ultimate fulfillment of the Silk Road's promise, a world so connected that distance and time have been almost entirely vanquished. The ghost of the road is now woven into the very light that carries our global conversation. But perhaps the most dramatic and controversial echo of the Silk Road in our time is a conscious and deliberate attempt to resurrect it. In 2013, the Chinese government announced the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history, the Belt and Road Initiative. It is a project of staggering scale and scope, a multi-trillion-dollar effort to re-energize these ancient corridors with a new generation of ports, railways, highways, and energy pipelines, physically connecting China to Southeast Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Its name is a direct homage to its ancient predecessor. The Silk Road Economic Belt refers to the overland routes, while the 21st century Maritime Silk Road refers to the sea lanes. One cannot look at the map of the Belt and Road Initiative without feeling a profound sense of historical vertigo. It is a project born of the same impulses that have always driven the Silk Road. For China, it is a grand strategy to secure its supply chains, open new markets for its goods, and project its power and influence across the globe. It is a move to reshape the world order and place China, once again, at the hub of a vast, interconnected network. Just as it was under the great Tang or Mongol-led Yuan dynasties. For the dozens of developing nations participating, it offers the promise of economic transformation, new infrastructure, new investment, and a connection to the engine of the global economy. It is the modern echo of an oasis city, hoping to find prosperity by linking its fate to the great network. And yet, this modern incarnation is shadowed by the same debates and anxieties that have always haunted the road. The project is hailed by some as the greatest development opportunity of our time, but criticized by others as a form of debt-trap diplomacy, a strategy to gain leverage over smaller nations by burdening them with unsustainable loans. Concerns over sovereignty, over the environmental impact, over the dominance of a single, powerful state, these are not new anxieties. They are the same fears that the smaller kingdoms of Central Asia must have felt when confronted with the might of the Tang army, or that Persian merchants may have harbored when forced to operate under the absolute authority of the Great Khan. The tension between opportunity and domination, between connection and subjugation, is the perennial drama of the Silk Road. The Belt and Road Initiative is simply the latest and grandest act in this very old play. Ultimately, the most profound legacy of the Silk Road is not etched in steel or found on a geopolitical map. It is found within us. It is the recognition that our modern, globalized selves are not a new invention. We are the direct descendants of the Silk Road traveler. The tech entrepreneur seeking new markets is the spiritual heir of the Sogdian merchant. The student backpacking across continents is the modern echo of the pilgrim monk seeking wisdom in a distant land. The international diplomat negotiating a treaty is walking in the footsteps of Zhang Qian and Rabin Bar Sama. We are still driven by the same fundamental desires, for profit, for knowledge, for faith, for adventure, for a connection to something larger than ourselves. The Silk Road forced those who traveled it to confront the most essential human questions. How do we build trust with those who are different? How do we find common ground? What is the proper balance between our own culture and the influences of another? These questions are more urgent today than ever before. The network is now global, its connections instantaneous, its stakes planetary. The road in the end was never about silk, it was about us. It is the enduring, sprawling, and often contradictory story of humanity's multi-millennial quest to overcome the distances that separate us. Its legacy is not in a museum. It is in the coffee you drink, the phone you hold, the ideas you debate, and the complex web of dependencies that defines our collective existence. The Silk Road is not a finished chapter in a history book. We are all right now traveling upon it. We are living in its most advanced, its most complex, and its most perilous age. The Silk Road wasn't just one trade network. It was a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and our innate desire for connection. From Zhang Qian's daring journeys to Zhang He's mighty fleets, it was the stories of individuals, merchants, monks, soldiers, and scholars, who wove the global tapestry that still shapes our world. Of course, history is never a single story. Scholars today debate the very term Silk Road, a 19th century invention, arguing it oversimplifies a far more complex web of interactions. They question the true nature of the Mongol peace. These debates are vital, reminding us that history is a living conversation. But what remains undisputed is the core message. When people, despite barriers of language, culture, and politics, choose pragmatic cooperation, they can achieve extraordinary things. The Silk Road is the ultimate story of us. It reminds us to embrace diversity, to adapt to immense challenges, and most importantly, to keep building bridges, not walls. Here at Secrets of the Ancients, we believe these stories from our past hold the keys to inspiring our future. If this journey moved you, please subscribe and press the bell icon so you don't miss our next expedition. Share this video with someone who loves history. Join us next time as we travel to the sands of Egypt to decode the enigmatic purpose of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Let's keep exploring the past together.